Hello, everyone, and welcome to the top 10 new features. Oh, sorry, wrong title. Getting disconnected with PowerShell. I was looking at last notes. We're here with Jeff Hicks today. I'm Chris Mogget from TrainSignal, and I'm just going to explain real quick how this presentation is going to go. I just want to draw your attention to the questions box in your webinar control panel. Jeff will be answering questions that you submit there today, so just go ahead and submit them at any time during the presentation. I also want to encourage everyone to use the hashtag TrainSignalLive on Twitter and tweet us any questions or comments or anything TrainSignal, and you'll be entered for a chance to win prizes, including a virtualization book, a t-shirt, and a number of any other one of our TrainSignal swag pieces. Today's presentation will also be recorded and available to view on our blog later this week. We will email you the link once it's ready. After you exit the webinar, you'll be prompted to take a short survey. We'd love to hear from you, so please take a few minutes to complete it. And now with all that out of the way, thanks for joining today's webinar, and here's Jeff.
Welcome everyone to this little webinar on getting disconnected with Windows PowerShell version 3. Real quickly, for those of you who don't know who I am, I'm a PowerShell MVP. I write books on PowerShell, I train PowerShell, I speak, breathe. Pretty much it's PowerShell all the time here for me. Some of the recent books I've been working on, and my blog is listed there, and I'm also pretty active on Twitter if you aren't following me. So, and you'll see this, and we'll try to make sure my slide deck as well as the demo stuff I'm going to show later is available to you. So enough about that. So why are we here? Well, I want to talk about PowerShell version 3 because it's part of the latest version of the Windows Management Framework, which is now really what we're deploying. It includes PowerShell 3, but it also includes our remoting infrastructure, the WSMan protocols, the WinRM service. And PowerShell 3 leverages these changes that have been made into the remoting infrastructure. We can still create persistent remote sessions like we did in version 2, but now we can also take that session and have it continue to run without any client interaction. So I can close my PowerShell session where I started it, and that session is still running on the remote server. What's cool about this is that I can now reconnect to that same session from a later PowerShell session on my computer. I could even reboot my computer and reconnect, or I could go home and connect from home, or go to a different computer and connect. So this offers up I think a new area of management possibilities, because I can now kick off a long-running task in a PowerShell session and then come back later whenever I need to and check the status of those commands that are running in that session. So that's really what I want to talk about here today. We have some new commandlets in PowerShell version 3 that we will use to work with these disconnected sessions. Disconnect PS session, connect PS session, and receive PS session. Hopefully the verb names are pretty self-explanatory as to what they are all about there. And again, we have some demos that will show how these commandlets work. We also have in PowerShell version 3 some commandlets. We have them in version 2, but they've been tweaked a bit or enhanced in version 3. Invoke command now allows me to run a command in a disconnected session. What will happen is I'll use invoke command as you normally do to invoke a script block or script, and you specify the remote computer or computers. When that command is executed, PowerShell will actually create a disconnected session on the remote computers. It runs the commands and then disconnects. So it kind of does some things for you automatically that you could do manually, which is what I'm going to be walking through in my demos. And get PS session, well, in version 2, when we ran get PS session, this would only show me sessions that I had created locally. But now with get PS session, I can also specify computer name, and it will show me my sessions that are on the remote computer. you cannot see sessions created by other people. You can only see sessions that are tied to your security account. So disconnected sessions, here's the thing. These are maintained server side. Whereas before in version 2, when you created this session, that session information was stored on your computer in your PowerShell session. So when your PowerShell session goes away, the remote session goes away. Now when we create a session, the session information and that object is stored on the remote server. This implies that PowerShell version 3 must be running on the remote server in order to take advantage of these disconnected sessions. The end result is that the session that you create is independent, excuse me, independent of the client session that created it. This is what allows us to disconnect and reconnect as we need to. Any commands that we run in that session, they continue to run until they complete, or there's an output buffer. If for some reason we're running a very complex command that's generating a lot of information to the pipeline and it fills up that buffer, the default behavior is to stop, but I'll show you a way we can kind of get around that. But commands will continue to run until you go back and receive information, maybe clear out that buffer. Sessions remain until you remove them, or there is an idle timeout. Now the idle timeout is not when the command stops running, it's when your session stops being connected. So you want to make sure that your idle timeout, which is really long by default, is long enough that your command will complete and give you time to go back and retrieve the results. So sessions don't remain forever, and if you were to reboot the remote computer, that would should also terminate any sessions. Now, session configuration, we can specify the idle timeout. When we connect to a remote server, we're connecting to the Microsoft PowerShell configuration on that server. Well, that session configuration has some parameters, some properties, which by default can be overridden, and one of those things is the idle timeout. As I mentioned, clock starts when the session is disconnected, not when your command stops. You can configure, and there's some command lists that we can work with that have these options. We can configure the idle timeout sec and the max idle timeout sec. The default value is in milliseconds. There's the value. Now this gets it can be a little confusing at first. As you look through the session configuration options and then you look at commandlet parameters, you may see some slight variations in the property and parameter names, but hopefully if you see idle and max, you'll be able to sort the rest of them out. They're not 100% consistent across the board there. So you can deal with the idle timeout. We may also need to deal with the output buffering mode. By default, it is set to block. This means it will stop execution of your commands when the buffer is full. Or you can specify drop, which is kind of like first in, first out, will overwrite the oldest data when the buffer is full. So your command will keep running, but anything that was written to the buffer first will be flushed out. And again, you can, when you create your session, you got to take these things into account, and if you need to override the default, you can specify a different output buffering mode. One of the ways that we can do this is by creating a session option object using new PS session option. In version 3, we can specify the output buffering mode and set that to drop. And we can also set the idle timeout, and then that value is in milliseconds. So with that option, I can then, when I create my session, I can then specify that session option. Another way, there's lots of ways to do things in PowerShell, right? We can also modify the built-in $PS session option preference variable but then any change you make that will apply to all the sessions. Personally, I would probably, if I need to make a slight change, I would stick and create a PS session option object and then include that when I execute my session. And then the last way is when you actually disconnect from a session, there's another option or another place where you can specify the output buffering mode and the idle timeout. So there are several places where you can specify these little fine-tuning points to your session. So the steps here are really quite simple. So I'm going to create a new PS session, and in this case I'll use, as you see on the slide, I'm going to use my session option that I would have created earlier, so that would have things like my idle timeout if I want the connection buffer information. So now I have a PS session to SRV01, which is running PowerShell version 3. I can now run invoke command using that session. I could enter the session interactively and do whatever I want. Basically, use the session as you normally would. I'm going to assume that this big task script is going to take a long time to run. So I'm going to invoke it in that session and then simply disconnect the session. It will disconnect and it will use whatever session options that I may have elected to use in that session option object. Now, later on, either from this computer or a different computer, but still using the same credentials, I can connect or reconnect, I suppose, to that session on SRV01. So I can do connect PS session and then the name of the computer. From there, I'm back to using it with invoke command, enter the session interactively, do whatever I want. I can disconnect it again if I want. When I am finished, all I need to do is remove the PS session, which should remove it on the remote server. I suppose an option is to just wait until the idle timeout kicks in and eventually it'll be cleaned up on the server, but we'll use remove PS session to get rid of it. So as I've kind of hinted, there are some limitations here. This does require PowerShell version 3 at both ends. So the client and the server both must be running PowerShell version 3, and obviously PowerShell remoting has to be enabled. You can only reconnect to your sessions. You can't connect or see sessions that belong to other people. You're only allowed one connection per session. So if you have a disconnected session and I'm on computer A and working with that disconnected session, so I'm connected to it, and Chris is on computer B, he may be able to see that there's a session open, even if he's using my credentials, or say we're both using the administrator account, he can't access that session because I am using it until I close that session or disconnect from it. Then he could connect to it, but again, he'd have to be using the same credentials. So you can't see sessions for other users. And you also can't disconnect if you're in the middle of an interactive session. So this will be a whole lot easier to understand once I get into some of the demos here. All right. So I'm going to try to switch over to a virtual machine, if I can find the right window here. All right, so I am in Windows 8 desktop here, and we're going to connect to some machines in my little test domain here. And again, this is the code that I'll make sure is available for you guys later to try out and look at for yourself. So once again, the session commandlets, get PS session, connect PS session, right? So those are the new things that we have to work with in PowerShell version 3. We can only connect and disconnect actually I should say you can only disconnect from a version 3 computer. So I'm going to verify that this computer, Chicago DC03, is running PowerShell version 3, and you can see here that the stack is version 3, so I'm good. So I can connect and disconnect from that computer. If it said 2.0, I can still use regular PowerShell remoting. I just can't do a remote disconnected session. So to show you all this, I'm going to create some regular sessions just so I have some things in my session variable. Chicago FP01 is running PowerShell version 3, and DC02 is running PowerShell version 2. Not that it should make too much difference here. All right, so I'm going to create a session, because I've created these other ones. I want you to see several sessions. I'm going to create a session to DC03 and just save it to a variable so it'll be easier to work with. Let's do look at $S. Okay, so there you can see the state of that session, and in fact you should be able to see all of my sessions. All right, so they're all open. They all look like normal sessions, which they are at this point. We can also, now those sessions are created, that's what I saw looking on my computer, but with get PS session, with the computer name parameter in version 3, I can also look at sessions that are created on a remote computer. So if I do check my version 2 machine, all right, so get PS session shows nothing. But when I check my version 3 machine, so there we go. And you can see here's the idle timeout, here's the output buffering mode, which are the defaults. So now I have a number of sessions. Some are using PowerShell version 2, some are using version 3. The ones that are version 3 are ones that I can disconnect from. So I'm going to go ahead, let's use that session. I'm going to run an invoke command. I'm going to set a variable $x equal to 123 and create a variable $logs. All right, so that command executed in that remote session on Chicago DC03. Let's just check the value of $logs to verify that it worked. My little test lab doesn't necessarily have a ton of horsepower. I'm running about 6 virtual machines at the same time here, so give this a moment. But it should come back and show me the value of $logs. The command may actually still be running in the session. There we go. All right, so now I have in my session, I have a couple of variables defined. I'm going to go ahead and create on that session a long-running task. So I'm going to create a job on Chicago DC03 to recursively search through the Windows directory. So there's my job. So now I have something going on with that session. Now's the fun part. We're going to disconnect PS session. You can specify here, you can see there are some parameters to specify the idle timeout, the output buffering mode. So I'm going to disconnect my session, $S, and I'm actually going ahead and just so you can see how you do this if you needed to do it, I'm going to set the idle timeout in seconds and the output buffering mode. Now here, so this is where I'm saying things weren't consistent. This value, if I remember right, is in seconds, and then in other places it's in milliseconds. So you have to look at the help to make sure you get things in the right format, the right value. So I'm going to disconnect that, You can see right there's the session. Now it shows disconnected. In fact, if I run get PS session, right, so there we go. So my other two sessions still open. I can keep working with. Chicago DC03 is now disconnected. And here's the fun part. I can go to a totally new session. In fact, I'm going to go to a new PowerShell tab. So in the ISC, this is a totally new PowerShell session. If I do get PS session, you see there's nothing there. If I do get PS session, computer name, so there we go. There's that session. In fact, I can even go to a totally different computer just to prove that there's nothing up my sleeve here. So I'm going to, all right, so hopefully you all see, let me check the, all right, so now I'm on Chicago FP01. I'm on a totally different computer. Let me make this kind of full screen here. And we can connect to this with the connect PS session commandlet. Let me make this a little bit bigger. If you haven't used show window in PowerShell version 3 to look at help, you really have to give it a try because it's a great way to look. So you can see there are lots of ways that I can connect. For our purposes, it's pretty simple though. All I need to do is specify connect PS session, the name of the computer, and I'm going to save this to a variable $S to make it easier to work with. So there's $S. Now you can see the session is opened. Let's invoke command. Let's look at that value of $S. I'm sorry, $X. It's 123. Let's look at the status of our job. All right, so it's still running. So I have now connected to this session running on Chicago DC3 from a totally different computer than where I created it. Think about that. Think about what possibilities that now opens up to you. You can kick something off. You can go home, come back, remote in later that evening, check the results, do your job, disconnect, come back if it's going to run overnight, and come back the next morning, log back, boot up your computer, connect. Really exciting stuff, I think. When I'm done, in this particular case, I'm just going to disconnect again. Now this error message, by the way, was the PS session 3 is created using the enable network access parameter. I have yet to find out. I mean, I've read the documentation and I've worked with it. This seems to have works with you doing remoting locally with a loopback. The implication, if you read that, seems to think that you can't connect from another computer, but that's not the case because I just did that. In fact, I'm going to go back to my other machine. So I don't know if there is a little bug or something. I need to look into that further. But if you see that warning, don't worry too much about it because from my work with disconnected sessions, it has not had any impact in what I've been trying to do. So I'm going to jump back to my Windows 8 box. Go back to my original session. All right, so we just connected. So now I am back to my original session. Let's go down to this code here. Again, just to verify. So my session still shows disconnected. Let me demonstrate how to run a session in a disconnected session. So invoke command has this new parameter in disconnected session. So it's just a switch. So I'm going to, on DC01, totally new computer, which is also running PowerShell version 3, I'm going to run this get WMI object and select a few properties. but I'm going to do it in a disconnected session. So invoke command, the script block in a disconnected session on this computer, Chicago DC01. Press F8. And you can see right away I get a session object back that shows disconnected. Just let me do get PS session again to show you that is in fact the case. So that's another way you can create a PS session which is disconnected, and it basically does all the things that I had done manually, creating the session, invoking command, then manually disconnecting it. If you know that you're going to invoke a long-running command and you want to be disconnected, just do it this way. It saves yourself some time. Now the next thing to do is we want to receive the data. This is where if you potentially have a process running remotely that's going to take a long time to run and you're worried about maybe filling the buffer, you will want to use receive PS session. Let's look at help real quickly for receive PS session. All right, so this gets the results of commands, as it says there, in disconnected sessions. Name's pretty clear. So if the session is currently connected, it gets the results that were running when the session was disconnected. So it will continue to run when you're done. Let's close that. Let's clear this. So I'm going to go ahead and receive the session. Basically, this is from DC01 that had that get WMI object command. And there's the result. Now remember, that is coming back as kind of a remoting, so that's all deserialized, but it worked. And there's then the results of my command. Now one thing you have to be careful of, once you receive the session, the data is gone. If I try to receive that again, I get nothing. There's no -keep like you might have with receive job. So if you are going to be doing receive session, probably the smarter thing to do is set that to a variable $data or whatever, so that you have saved the data, because once you receive it, it's gone. Now the last thing that we might need to do is remove our sessions when we're done. So we should still have a couple open, one disconnected, so that DC01, when I received it, it left it open. Now I'm going to try, let's see how this works here. I have a note here, be careful when trying to remove sessions that are opened in a different session. So if you created the session here, went to another computer and opened it up and tried to remove it here, you could run into, might get some weird results. So I would make sure that the session is closed and not in use wherever it might be before you remove it. So if you're going to be working with PS sessions in a team environment, you're going to have some sort of procedure or practice to try to make sure that you guys aren't stepping on each other's toes when it comes to this. So let's try to remove. I'm going to get all my sessions because I'm done with all of them and remove them. So there you can see that session 3 could not be connected and removed. If I look here, let's run get PS session. So locally, it looks like I don't have anything. If I check Chicago DC 03, see, it still shows there as disconnected. So I kind of cleaned up on my end, but there's still a session object on DC 03 that has to be cleaned up. So if you run into that, what I have found to do is get the PS session, connect it, and then remove it. Now I get no errors, and now when I run get PS session locally and on the computer, that is still there. Well, I continue to work with that. Eventually that session will go away, and it may be just because of the latency in my virtual network that hasn't cleaned up yet, but it will clean up, trust me. Then lastly, there are some help topics. If you do help about remote_remote star, you should see, let me run this here, you should see a few topics, so be sure to look through that as well. All right, so there's my little demonstration here on how to work with PS sessions. Let me go back to the slides and finish up a few things here. All right, so kind of to sum up here, disconnected sessions, from the way that I look at it anyway, is really, it's kind of a nice compromise between remote scripting, meaning you're writing some script that's taking advantage of remoting, and workflow. Workflow is a totally different animal, requires a different mindset. And then scripting is just, I've got a script that I want to use, dash computer name to connect it and do something. With a disconnected session, I can have something that is going to take a long time to run and then come back to it, but it's not as robust as workflow, being able of surviving reboots, for example. So if you have something take a long time, maybe more than a script but less than a workflow, a disconnected session may be a good solution for you. But this kind of brings me to the main point here, is you need to plan how you're going to take advantage of this feature. This is especially true if you are in a team environment and you're going to have several administrators possibly using this, because you need to make sure that you're not stepping on each other's toes, that you have some way of knowing when you have a session open, because remember, you can only see your own sessions. Please, please test everything that I've shown you here and that you read about. You got to test these session techniques, test the parameters for things like idle timeout and the output buffer mode. Think about what you're going to run that you might need to use a disconnected session, and test how you're going to receive the results. You're going to connect, disconnect, clean up, because you need to make sure you understand all of this in a non-production environment before you go live. And certainly, if you haven't done this already, you need to plan your PowerShell version 3 upgrade strategy. This doesn't require Server 2012 or Windows 8, but it does require PowerShell 3 and PowerShell remoting. So if you have those installed on your Windows 2008 servers, Windows 7 desktops, you can take advantage of these disconnected sessions. In terms of some resources for PowerShell and other things, again, there's that about_remote disconnected session help topic. We covered disconnected sessions in the PowerShell in-depth book, which just came out. I haven't gotten to it yet. I'm still at the beginning of Lee Holmes' new edition of the PowerShell cookbook, but I'm expecting there's probably something in there. That's a good book anyway for PowerShell IT pros. The team blog, my blog, I do write, for those of you who don't know, the Professor PowerShell column for mspmag.com. I haven't done much yet with disconnected sessions, but I will probably add that at some point this year, so you should see some articles there. And if you have any problems with disconnected sessions, working with PowerShell in general, if you don't know about the forums at PowerShellCommunity.org, I encourage you to come by. Myself and lots of PowerShell MVPs and a lot of people who are very active in the PowerShell community are active there and very eager to help people with their PowerShell questions, which kind of brings us to the last point here, which is your questions. So there is a chat, there's a little question pane, which I think you can put things in. Now, there's a question here about conflict with linkconf.com. I don't know if that is with the form, with the...
Hey, Jeff.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
The first question, some of those questions were from when we were starting.
Okay.
The first question is, what OSs is PowerShell 3.0 available for?
PowerShell 3 is available for Windows 7, Service Pack 1, I believe, and Windows Server 2008 or 2008 R2, and again, there's service packs. But basically, anything older than 2008, you cannot run PowerShell version 3. When you go to the download page for Microsoft for the Windows Management Framework, down at the bottom it will display the operating systems that is supported, and you should not install PowerShell version 3 on Exchange 2007, 2010, SharePoint, Small Business Server. Again, look closely at the fine print. There are a few platforms where you'll run into conflicts, you'll break things if you install PowerShell version 3.
Okay, the next question is from Egon Peterson. I may have to rephrase my question. He was asking a couple. How many concurrent incoming sessions can Server 2012 have?
How many concurrent sessions? That should depend on the configuration of the server. Here, let me bring back DC. Okay, bring back my Windows 8. So let's look here. $PS. All right, so we want to look at this Microsoft.PowerShell session configuration. I think it is displayed there. Microsoft. All right, let's see here. Max concurrent users is 5. So I believe that is it, but those are things that you can reconfigure your remoting session to raise the number of concurrent sessions, and you can change all these defaults. So like if you wanted to change the idle timeout, change the output buffering mode, and have it apply, you can go ahead and do that when you configure PowerShell. Maximum shells per user. What they did do in PowerShell version 3 to help with some of this is they raised the maximum memory per shell, so it's now a gig. But hopefully that answered the question.
Okay. The next question is, if you can't see other user sessions, how would you handle another user who needed to reboot that server? Would they get any warning that a session is running by another user? How does that work?
If you have a session open, yeah, that's part of the communication that you're going to have to work out. I'm not sure, you could see, when you do remoting, there's a particular process that you can see, but I don't know if you won't be able to tell who started that remote session. I mean, the only people who should be doing, remoting should be admins or, IT professionals, but you're going to have some process. I have not found a good way to manage that. That may be a feature that we're going to need for PowerShell version 4. But that's something I'm going to keep looking into because I'd like to be able to find out when a session started, who started it, but I've not been able to find how to do that or if it can even be done.
Okay, Jeff, we have some questions from Twitter, actually. Hashtag TrainSignalLive. Can you use remoting/PS session with a DMZ environment, connecting from a domain environment?
Connecting in a DMZ, is that what you said?
Connecting from a domain environment is what they said.
All right, run that. So well, the disconnected session or remoting in general works best in a domain environment because the remoting authentication is using Kerberos. If you are trying to do remoting outside of a domain environment, then you have to follow the instructions for remoting and set that up, either using certificates in SSL or configuring trusted hosts. But it can be done, but the best way to manage this is in a domain environment. I'm not quite sure I totally follow that question, but I think that's what they were asking. Hopefully they weren't waiting for an answer on Twitter.
Well, next question, Jeff. Um, is it not possible to see all sessions running on a server, even if I log onto the server locally?
If you are logged onto the session locally, that's a good question. Let's. How much time do we have here? We can test that real quickly. All right, I'm going to test it. That's an excellent question. So I'm going to open a new PS session to Chicago FP01. And so the first one I'm logged on with an account of Jeff, and this one I'm going to do with credential. Get my administrator. All right, so on my computer, I show two sessions to Chicago FP01. Now I'm going to jump to Chicago FP01. Where I'm logged on. Okay, so I'm logged on as Jeff. Let's do get PS session. And that's my session to DC03. Yeah, so I cannot see by sitting on this server what sessions are open. But this WSMP prov host, that's the process that indicates that there is a remoting session. There might still be a way to uncover by sitting on the server to see who is connected to me, but I have not been able to find that, or I've overlooked the obvious. Because get PS session doesn't work. I can do get PS session configuration, but that's not going to show me the actual session. That's just what is configured. So there is no way, at least right now, that I've been able to find to see, and this doesn't have anything really to do with disconnected session, this is just remoting in general, to see what sessions, that there are sessions open other than looking for those processes. Okay? What else?
Okay, Jeff. We had another question from a beginner of PowerShell. I'm a beginner of for PowerShell, but I have the requirement in my Citrix-based VDI project to know information about session latency, disconnected/reconnected session details, etc. What do you suggest the path to learn those things with PowerShell?
I'm not quite sure I follow that. What do they want to learn?
It says they're asking that they looking for information on session latency, disconnected and reconnected session details, and the best way to go about learning those things.
Well, I'm not quite sure about latency. Is just going to be should be a factor of just your network efficiency and server utilization, so how quickly it responds. As you can see, my latency is pretty poor at times because I'm constrained with my virtual machines that I'm working with. Really, the first place to start is to read the documentation that comes with PowerShell. Look at those remoting topics that I showed, and they just have to try it in a test environment. That's really the best way to learn this. Whether you're a beginner or have been using PowerShell 2 for a while and want to see this new disconnected stuff.
Okay. And before we finish up today, we had a couple people ask about places to get practice code. Like in some of your courses you've given out, some of the code you've worked on in train signal training courses for people to get started with. What are some other ways people can get those kinds of resources?
If you're talking about, my code, the code for the train signal courses, I think that varies on the course. I'm not quite sure where. I think some of that stuff is on the DVD. I'll let you guys address the train signal stuff. For non-train signal things, I write a lot of PowerShell code on my blog, on the Professor PowerShell column, a little bit on Google+, although Google+ doesn't like it when you paste any sort of code. It kind of reformats it. And if you're looking for, full-blown PowerShell scripts, then you go to poshcode.org. That would be another great resource if you're looking for PowerShell scripts. But for my stuff, basically the blog and Professor PowerShell are the primary places. You might also check the Petri IT Knowledge Base because I blog or write articles for them as well, which includes a lot of PowerShell stuff. I hope that answered the question.
That was great, Jeff. Well, everybody, that's all the time we have today. Thanks for attending and for all the participation and questions. If you have more comments or feedback, you can always email us at webinars@trainsignal.com. As a reminder, today's webinar was recorded and will be available to view at trainsignal.com/blog/webinars. We will also email you the link in a few days. And remember, as you leave, please fill out the survey and have a great day.